Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and on Facebook a couple of weeks ago I asked what fabric to cover this old book. The spine was coming off and since then has actually come right off. So I gave a choice between 4 different fabrics to see what other people would like. I did have books, a measuring tape in a nice yellow, measuring tapes in a old-fashioned black and gray, and notions. Out of them all, the notions did win the vote. So I am going to be covering this 1943 book called The Complete Book of Sewing. I'll give you a quick peek of this book. It's really a fascinating book. I love to collect vintage sewing books. Inside, the book does say it was printed in New York, New York, and the first copyright was in 1943, and there's no second copyright in this book, so this would be the first copyright. And of course, all of the chapters. And wait till you see some of the clothing. It talks about choosing your color towards your skin tone, your hair. It talks about different styles of dressing, necklines, designing your own patterns, fabrics, children's clothing. Then it goes into basic hand stitching and essential sewing. So it's not only for dressmaking, but it is for the home. I just love some of these old illustrations. I would definitely make that and wear it still today. And if I really want to, they do have diagrams to make a slip-on blouse, panties, and a bra. So this is definitely a book that I want to cover. So the technique that I'm going to show you to cover a book will cover any book at all. So you need to start with the book that you're going to cover, and then we can add some fabric. So I did use the fabric with the sewing machines and the notions on it. So I put 2 layers together, a very thin quilt batting, and quilted those 2 layers. This piece needs to be a lot bigger than that book because I'm going to trim it down. In the book cover, there's going to be a spine covering. So any piece of fabric will cover the spine inside. The book will need pieces of fabric on each side. So we're going to need 2 pieces of fabric that will definitely fit this cover. So this is all the fabric we're going to need. So the first thing will be working on that front cover and getting it quilted. From there, we're going to be able to decide on the size. I will be marking the wrong side of the fabric, so I do have the right side facing down. It's important that you do all of your measurements with the book closed, because the book outside dimensions is bigger when the book is closed than when it's opened. You can see that that cover is going to go all the way around. When I open it up, you will notice that we'll have some extra space. So our measurements need to be when the book is at its largest, which is when it's closed, going around. And I do not use any measurements at all. I just use the book as a guide. So I'm going to wrap that quilted cover on the book until I find how I would like that cover to look. I do like that sewing machine in the corner, so that's how I'm going to have it. With the cover on the way that I want, I'm just going to peel it back and I'm going to draw some lines around the outside of the book. And in this case, I'm going to use a chalk. Without moving it, fold that cover over, pick it up, turn it over, and draw the second side. And at the very last, I will give it a test to make sure that it did not move much. Now I'm going to be able to take that book and put it aside, and I can straighten up those edges. These lines that I'm drawing will not be stitching lines or cutting lines. They're just my minimal size lines. And I'm going to be able to use those as a guide and just straighten up the lines. So I now have that shape squared up. From here we need to decide on a seam allowance that we want to use. We will need to take into consideration that we do have the thickness of that cover, the thickness of the fabric, and the thickness of the fabric being pulled over to the right side. So if you have a very thick cover, you're going to have to add a larger seam allowance. And I definitely would rather go bigger than smaller because we're going to be able to trim it down after. So I'm going to trim 1 inch all the way around. So this is my starting size. I'm going to make a plain cover, so I'm not going to add to the cover. But you could embroider down the spine the name of the book. You could add pockets to the front, little areas for pens. Anything that you want, you could add that. The next thing I'm going to want to do is the fabric for the inside. So I'm just going to take a piece of fabric and I'm going to fold along the edge once, twice, and stitch that down so I have a little rolled seam. And I'm going to do that to 2 pieces of fabric, one for the front and one for the back. Once those edges have been turned over, I'm going to lay them in the book close to the edge, just leaving maybe a 1/2 inch, and close the book. When the book is closed, I want to be able to see the fabric. And do that to both sides. Just line that fabric up, close the book. You can always adjust it. I now want to put the right side of the fabric around the book. So be sure that you have the book in the right direction. And I'm going to be able to use those lines as a guide to line that book back up to where I originally had it. I have the 2 good sides of the fabric touching on both areas. From here, I'm just going to pin these layers together right along that edge. It's going to be tight, but not super tight. This gives me a chance to straighten things out and make sure everything is smooth. So I have that one side pinned together. I can give a double check inside to make sure it's all right. Make sure everything's smoothed. And pin that second side. And I can check and make sure that that side looks good. Once we're pinned, we're going to be able to take that cover off. Fold the covers together, the pages out, and just slide that out. So we do have the right sides touching. And I can see where those pins are, and that's going to give me a guide for stitching. But before we do any stitching, I need to put the spine cover in. So it's just any piece of fabric, and it's going to go right over top. I'm not going to finish off those edges because I want them as flat as possible. So I'm just going to smooth it out and flip that fabric over. And that fabric was also good side facing in. And just pin that on. My pins did line up with that original line that I traced the book with. If there is a seam that is not lining up with the pins, we can redraw that seam. Now I'm going to take those pins and I'm going to turn them sideways. And that way I can bring this right to the machine. I now will be able to take this to the machine and sew a seam allowance. This line that I pinned on is not the seam allowance. I need to go over a 1/4 inch. And if you have a really thick cover, you'll have to do more than a 1/4 inch. So you can draw a line if you'd like for that 1/4 inch seam allowance, or use the edge of your foot. And for the first row of stitching, I use big stitches because I want to test this, and then if it needs to be tightened, I'm going to be able to tighten it. And if it needs loosening, it's easier to take out big stitches than small ones. Once that first row of stitching is done, I can trim off all of this extra. To test it, we will need to turn this all right side out. So the spine will go over first, and then these sides. From here, we're going to be able to see, do I want it a little bit tighter, or does it need to be looser? But you're going to be able to judge with your own book. Then gently take that off, turn it right so it's the wrong side facing. Make sure that extra spine piece comes around. Now I'm going to be able to stitch that proper seam. I will put my machine back to my regular stitch length, which is 2.5. I will stitch all the way around, pivot on those corners, and keep going all the way around. Now that that final row of stitching is done, I'm going to be able to trim it. And I will leave about 1/4 inch seam allowance. On these little ends, I'm just going to do a triangular cut so that I take off some of that bulk from that center. One final press, and I make sure that I have no threads. And then I'm going to turn this right side out. And if you'd like, you can even give this a press and make sure that that seam is up tight right along that edge. That cover is now complete. This little spine cover is going to have this edge turned over nicely, and it will help protect that spine. I can now insert that in. I do want to make sure that my cover is going in the right direction. Fold it in half. So I'm having both sides in a little at a time. Now just pull this in. And before I close it, I do want to keep that spine. So I'm going to slide it in so it'll stay there. And now we have a nice cover for the book. The book cover is on firmly, but it's not on tight. We do not want to put any pressure because we do not want that cardboard inside to bend out of shape, but we do want it to fit snugly. Now this method can be used for old books, new books, soft books, hard books, large books, small books. By having the book do all the measurement for us, we don't have to worry about the size. I'm so happy with the way the book cover has turned out. This fabric is called Material Girl, and it is from Northcott, and it definitely suited that antique book. Thank you for those that participated in voting for the fabric for me to use, and thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe and come on back. Let's see what we're talking about next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.